Okay, we are being recorded for posterity's sake. So aside from the Chai Academy on the website, you can also go to YouTube and search Chai Academy, and you will have also 100 plus classes. And I think we got permission from a Rabbi Goldberg to upload his classes. So and we're going to enhance it as we go along. So we'll begin. Yesterday's Torah portion, we read Vayechi. Vayechi, Yaakov lived. Now this is the last parasha, the last portion in Genesis. And this week we start Exodus, which is really amazing how fast time flies. But essentially, last week, Yaakov, Jacob, and Yosef were reunited, and Yaakov moved down to Egypt, and Yosef, there was a famine, and Yosef fed the entire family. And the Torah begins this week by Yaakov, that Yaakov lived in the land of Mitzrayim 17 years. Right? So now it's interesting. Yosef was sold at 17 years. So Yaakov had 17 years he had 17 years. When Yosef was sold, Yaakov had a great 17 years. Then when he reunited with Yosef, he had 17 years, exactly the same amount. So he had, remember Yosef, he had him when he was very old. Right. So that's called so Yaakov in total lived 147 years, right? He had him, Yosef left him when he was 130, and he was reunited. Yosef left him when he was reunited 130. So anyway, the Rashi says that these were good. These were good years Yaakov had. So it's interesting. The fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, he went over to the third Lubavitcher Rebbe went over to his grandfather, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, and said, "How can you say that Yaakov's best years were in Egypt? They were in Egypt. They weren't in Israel. They weren't, they were in Egypt. How could the Torah say they had great years and best years there? It seems counterintuitive." So the Alter Rebbe said that Yaakov, when he was in Canaan, when he was in Israel, he wasn't in exile. When he went to Egypt, he was in exile. But those in exile, he studied Torah. As it says last week, that Yehuda opened up a yeshiva, Yehuda opened up a place for the Levium to study, right? He went before. He said, if you're spiritually successful in exile, that's the best years. Because and I always say this, to be observant, to be kosher, right? When you live in Borough Park or Williamsburg or Crown Heights or Monsey or Kiryat Yoel or whatever it may be, or in Jerusalem, right? It's okay, so you're kosher, right? But to be kosher in a place where you got to work hard or you got to work harder, right? I don't think Long Island is hard, but it's definitely harder. But to be kosher in Kentucky, for example, he says that is the best years. That is the best years, because if you basically, exile is there to defeat you spiritually, but instead of defeating you spiritually, you defeat it. Those are the best. Those are the best years. So, hey, good morning, Herman.
Hi.
So it says Yaakov came close to him passing, and there's a medrash that says that Yaakov was the first one that got sick. In the Torah, it doesn't say anything about sickness except when it came to Yaakov. So the midrash says that Yaakov was the first one to get sick, and Yaakov asked for it. Yaakov prayed for it. Yaakov said, there's a benefit to getting your affairs in order, as opposed to just, and as the Medrash says, people used to sneeze and die, right? Sneeze and die. True. Nowadays, we sneeze and we sneeze. My mother sneezes 10 times in a row, and she's fine, right? But Yaakov asked for, instead of instant sudden death, that there should be something delayed so we can set our affairs in order and he can take care of his kids, etc., etc. So they say actually when we sneeze, we pull our left ear. I don't know if you've ever seen it. And we say, your salvation I hope for God. They say, what is that about? That is about that there was supposed to be, when Adam and Eve were created, there wasn't, the idea of mortality was not given to mankind yet. Man was supposed to live forever. But because they didn't listen to God and ate from the forbidden fruit, so they were now became mortal. So we pull on the ear that it was because we didn't listen, right? Because you didn't listen, mortality was introduced. So Yaakov got sick and he called Joseph and he asked Joseph, please swear to me that you will not let me be buried in Egypt, but rather I want to be buried in the place of my ancestors. And Joseph swore. That was a brilliant strategy because later on, when Yaakov did die and Joseph asked permission, he says, I swore to my father. So Pharaoh said, okay, since you swore, I'm not going to tell you to invalidate the swearing. I respect a swearing, I expect a commitment. But if you just would have said, I affirm, I don't know if he would have let Yaakov be buried. So, but, and we'll get more into it. So Joseph swore to him. A short time later, it was told to Joseph that your father's really sick. And so Joseph came with his two sons, and Yaakov basically apologized to Joseph. And he says, I'm asking you once again to bury me in the land of my ancestors, even though I did not bury your mother there. I buried your mother on the way to the ancestors, on the side of the road in Beit Lechem. I didn't go to Hebron. I didn't make it as far. It's not far. Geographically, it's not far. But he said, I never did it. So I apologize. And he says, but actually, as it says in the Medrash, that God told him to bury her here because when the temple was destroyed, the first temple, and the Jews ran from Jerusalem, they passed by her grave. And the legend is that they stopped for a few moments on their running. And they prayed by Rachel because she was buried on the side of the road. Please. And they say that Rachel asked Rachel mevakar baneha. Rachel prayed for her children, asked God to reinstate the Holy Temple, which was done 70 years later. So he says, then he looked at his children and he says, okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to reward you for your suffering. He told Joseph. He says, you will be split into two tribes. You will no longer be known as Joseph, but you'll be known as Ephraim and Manasseh, your two kids. And they will receive two portions in the land of Israel, not one, but two. That was the blessing. And he told Joseph, if you have any more kids after that, they're yours. But these two, I'm going to consider mine.
Isn't it also a reward for Osna? Dina?
I think Joseph needed a reward for a number of reasons. I think Joseph, first of all, sustained them during famine times. He sustained them. They didn't miss a meal. They didn't have to worry about where the next, right? So I think it was partly as a thanks. I think it was partly as his suffering, partly as that he married, as Paz says, he married Dinah's daughter who was raped by Shechem. So Shimon married Dinah, but Joseph married Dinah's illegitimate daughter. So he rewarded him. I think there was, anyway, then he says, who are these? Now, Joseph just introduced his kids. So was Yaakov, did Yaakov have Alzheimer's or dementia? So the Rashi says that Joseph looked at these kids and he saw dread. He saw that there were bad people going to be destined to come out from them. Right? He saw, so he said, who are these? What's going on here? So Joseph said, Bonayan, they're my kids. And why only look at the bad, Dad? Right? They're great people are going to come out from them. So he was corrected. He says, bring them here. I want to bless them. So he brought Ephraim by his right hand and Manasseh Sorry, he put Manasseh at his right hand, Ephraim at his left hand, and he put his hands on them. He says, bless them. Yaakov crossed his hand, so his right hand, which is the stronger blessing, was placed on the younger kid, Ephraim. And Joseph tried to remove them. And he says, no, Dad, no, right, the elder is here. He goes, he'll be great too, but this one will be greater. Who came out of Ephraim? Yeshua bin Nun. Who came out of Manasseh? Gideon. Right? Gideon, the one who led into battle against the Philistines. So so they both had good people come out of them, but Yaakov blessed Ephraim because Joshua really needed it. Joshua was taking the Jews into Egypt, out of the desert into Israel, so he blessed them. And he blessed them. He says, "Yisimcha lekim k'Ephraim and Manasseh." People are going to bless their kids that you should grow up like Ephraim and Manasseh. And the malach, the angels that have guided me will guide your kids. And you should be proliferate like fish, the kerev haaretz, in the midst of the land. And there's a discussion about fish. Why does it say you proliferate like rabbits, proliferate like the Arabs or the Chinese? Why do you say, or the Indians? Why do you say proliferate like fish? Is because fish, if you think of a salmon, it bucks the tide. If a fish would swim strictly with the tide, it would crush itself on the rocks. It would be too fast. So the fish swims a little bit it swims sideways, and it swims it swims uphill, against the tide, right, in order to save itself. So Yaakov blessed the Jewish people. Yaakov blessed the Jewish people that they should be able to buck the trend, right? That maybe the trend says, and the trend could be wacky. The trend could be that we have, on a birth certificate, we have males, females, and X, or that we have, we don't use pronouns anymore, he, she, right? But rather we use it or I don't know, they. So some crazy stuff and the craziest stuff I think is going to come out before the pendulum swings. So he says that we need, you need to swim upstream. Just because the world, just because the world worships idolatry, it doesn't mean we should. And we throughout our years, we have been the moral conscience, the Jewish people. And that's one of the reasons we're hated, is because we bring morality. And how do we bring morality? By saying this is not right. This is no, it's not acceptable, X, Y, and Z. So that was the blessing. And he blessed Ephraim before he blessed Manasseh. With the right hand. He gave him, he says, I'm going to give you Shechem Achat. I'm going to give you one more portion, which was Shechem. Right? Yosef was buried in Shechem and Nablus. Yosef, in fact, every couple of years, they smash Yosef's tomb and they set it aflame, and then it's rebuilt for the next fire. So Yosef is buried in Shechem. I mentioned this yesterday, that many, if not most, of our biblical figures are buried in Judea and Samaria. The whole life took place in Judea and Samaria. King David was king in Hebron most of his life, and then he went to Jerusalem. But the courts and David ben Yishai, where did Yishai live? He lived in Judea and Samaria. So when they say that the Jews saw Palestine and Judea and Samaria as the West Bank and it's the occupied territories, I have a real issue with that, because this is the gist of our history, right? The area that we call Israel is and particularly central Israel, which is where Judea and Samaria are, is really our ancestry, right? Gaza was not. Gaza, Joshua never conquered. They say Aku was an argument in the north, whether they conquered, whether it was part of biblical Israel or not. There's an argument, right? Elat is not biblical Israel, but biblical Israel is Judea and Samaria. So there's insanity that rules when they say that Israel did not take Israel. Judea and Samaria does not belong to Israel. It is a miscarriage of justice. And by the way, there's another interesting part to this also, is that when the Jewish state, the modern Jewish state in 1948 was made, was allowed by the UN, from 1948 to 1967. So the day the British left in 1948 is the day Israel claimed a state, right? We have a state. Arafat or anybody else that was around did not claim a Jewish state a Palestinian state in those 19 years. From 1948 to 1967, Israel was living on UN land. The UN gave it to Israel. And there was no state. In 19 years, that's 7,000 or 70,000 hours to claim a Palestinian state. They did not. In 1964, which is 3 years before the Six-Day War, Arafat founded the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. What was he liberating? Israel wasn't occupying anything they shouldn't have, even according to them. So there's a lot of
because they won the whole thing.
Right, but from 1948.
It's not just that. I mean, the UN declaration when Israel got independence was independence to two separate countries, a Jewish state and an Arab state.
Right. And
they refused to accept it.
Right, the Arabs.
It's not that they didn't claim it, they refused to accept it.
Right, but they never claimed a Palestinian state, ever.
They never did.
They never did. Moving on. Yaakov called, if you look at it, this is chapter 49, if you're following inside, Yaakov called to his children, and he says, hey, Osfu, gather round, and I will tell you what will happen in the end of days, right? That's the first verse. The next verse, he says, gather round and listen to your father. So they say that he said, gather round. He called them and he was going to tell them that you're going to be in slaves for 210 years. And then you're going to, but that was withdrawn from him. That prophecy was withdrawn. So the first reason for calling them became moot. So then he said, gather round and listen to me. And there was no mention of Achris Hayamim at the end of days. So he gathered round his kids. And in the Midrash, it says that he said, Shema Yisrael, and the children said, Baruch Shem. Yaakov was concerned that some of his kids will assimilate or have assimilated in Egypt thus far in the 17 years. And they said, Shema Yisrael, and they answered Baruch Shem. So his fears, he felt, were unfounded at the moment. And he started to bless them. He blessed each one individually. Some of them didn't sound like necessarily a blessing. So Reuven was a blessing. Shimon and Levi, he told them off. He said, your anger you have to curb, which as we discussed yesterday, telling your child to curb their anger is a blessing, because if you don't do it, no one will. So he told them that, that the apam in your anger is not appropriate. You get too angry and you lose control. So he basically was not happy with, but he didn't curse them. He just said, I want no part of your anger. I want who you really are. Yehuda, he blessed, and on and on and on and on and on. Many of them, he compared them to different animals. And they say that was just prophecy that he had. He said, Zebulun, right, shall settle by the seashores. And they did. Haifa is Zebulun's territory, right? And by the way, the Zebulun's logo, each one had a logo, and they developed the logos right here, is a boat, right? And he's, so Yisachar was a donkey because Yisachar basically bore the burden of the Jewish people. Yisachar used to study and used to spiritually bless the Jewish people.
How come those sons, Yaakov's sons,
Yeah.
are not considered to be matriarchs also? If older, everything is named after them, everything is lineage after them.
Right.
This one is from this Shevet, this one's from the other Shevet, and they're not considered to be.
Right. I think that's at a certain point. Pause this question: how come they're not considered also matriarchs and patriarchs? Well, first of all, we don't know who they were married to. It's interesting. They married Canaanite women, it seems, according to Rashi. So they didn't marry anybody of the fam jam, right? Secondly, is I think that they themselves viewed Abraham. They the ones who set Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov as the patriarchs. They did it. That Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah.
Nobody calls themselves, it's a title that's been kind of
right. So then they went to Egypt, and then they were what's it called in Egypt? They were incarcerated in Egypt, and so they said that we have 3 fathers and 4 mothers. They're the ones that started it. The rest are known as the Jewish people. They weren't the original founders.
Do we know where they're all buried?
Yeah, we do know where they're buried. Some of them are buried in Israel. Some of them are buried outside of Israel. One of them is actually buried in north in Syria, which is present-day Syria. It's interesting. In Israel, you'll be driving, and then all of a sudden you see a brown sign, right? And it with an arrow saying Kever Dan. This is where Dan's buried. And you go out, and there's a little hut, and that's where Dan ben Yaakov. It says Dan ben Yaakov, Dan's buried. Anyway, each of them were given different. Many of them were given different logos. Usher was oil because Usher's territory that he got. So Yaakov was prophesying that he got was oil. They say that basically you could walk in Usher's territory and step on olives and make oil as you're walking. They said there's a story told that somebody needed a million barrels of oil, and he was able to buy it from one merchant. Right? Naphtali was swift, right? Yosef was an ox because of what he stood up against. Right, Benjamin was a wolf, and this actually became the logos. And they, after Yaakov did this, they actually made logos for their tribes. So when they carried Yaakov eventually out of Egypt to bury him, they actually were in formation. And when they traveled in the desert, it was the same formation when they got out of Egypt. It was exactly the same formation that Yaakov told them, and they had their flags. Anyway, he blessed them, and he says, I'm about to be gathered to my people once again. Judah means thankful, absolutely. And that's why we're called Yehudim, thanks. We're not called rubies. We're not called Simonites, right? We're not called Levium. Some of us are Levium, Steve Levy, Lenny Levine, both not Levium. But we're called Yehudim because to thank and to appreciate is vital. Yaakov once again asked his sons, please do not bury me here. Bury me where the and where the rest of my family was buried. And it says, the verse 33 says, he gathered his legs, which probably means that he went onto the bed, as Rashi says. Vayigva, and he expired, and he was gathered into his people. So the Talmud comments that Yaakov did not die. Nowhere does it say that Yaakov died. It just says he was gathered into his people. So the Talmud says, and Rashi quotes it, Mazar b'chaim afu b'chaim. Just as his children are alive, so too he is alive. And it's referring to a spiritual life. when a parent that's taught their kids, how to make kiddush, how to light Shabbos candles, how to do this, that, or the other, put on tefillin, and whatever it may be, and the kid follows in those footsteps, so they're alive. So it causes that the soul remains connected and alive. That's what it means. Alive means connected. And likewise, it doesn't have to be the aforementioned mitzvahs, but and this is why people, this is the reason why people, they dedicate things in someone's memory. They do mitzvahs in someone's memory. So let's say a person, I'm thinking of the Wolfsons. So the Wolfsons, when the old man Wolfson was alive, he gave money to Esha Torah. When he died, his kids gave much more money to Esha Torah. That was their way of making sure their father's alive, right? Now, the fact that Wolfson would refuse to give money to Chabad anywhere, that we'll talk about some other time. But that's the idea. You follow in your loved one's footsteps. Yosef fell on his father. He cried for him. He kissed to him. The halacha, by the way, which is interesting. The halacha says that that one is forbidden to kiss their loved one when their loved one passes. You're forbidden to kiss. Right, that's considered inappropriate. Somebody once passed in hospital, and I was there, and then their family came. I waited for them. They're there, and one of the children gets up and lays with their father. It was beautiful. She laid with her father, and she cried, and she had her arm around him. But I told her, don't kiss, no kissing. So, because that's what the halacha says. Anyway, Yosef.
They did a lot of unhalachic stuff, right, with Jacob.
So it says they embalmed him and
mummified him.
Right, they embalmed him, and so Rashi says, what does it mean? They embalmed him is that they placed him in beds of flowers, but so they mummified him. That's what it seems like they did.
I mean, they kept him there for what, 40 days?
He was 40 days in myrrh, right? Myrrh and oil, right? So they kept him for 40 days, and then they mourned him for 30 days. So Yaakov didn't get buried, and then they traveled. So Yaakov was probably laid in state. He laid in state for 70 days, essentially. And then they traveled. Then they put him on a plane to go to Arlington, right? So Yaakov, now there's an interesting commentary that I read that the reason why Yosef knew that the Egyptians are not going to let Yaakov go. Yaakov was considered a great personality, and that's why Yosef had to ask for permission. He was considered holy by Egyptian standards, right, and a quasi god. Yosef wanted to make sure that if Yaakov's body did not decompose, then he would be a real god, and they wouldn't let him. So they say Yosef said, embalm him and mummify him. So that way, the fact that he didn't decompose is due to the mummification and the embalming. And so we know that tzaddikim, real tzaddikim, do not compose. They do not decompose, I should say. So there is a story that happened not so long ago, probably about 40 years ago. Is the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe was buried in Rostov, and the Rostov government, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the cemetery would make a great road, a shortcut to somewhere. So they told people, they made announcements that we're going to tear up the cemetery and remove a body if you want, or it would just be it'll be buried under tar and. So the Rebbe in America sent to Rostov. We're talking about this is in the 50s or 60s. And he sent to Rostov, he sent two of his Hasidim to overlook when they exhumed the Rebbe Rashab. So they exhumed him. The Rebbe Rashab was already buried 30 years there. And so maybe more, 40 years. So they exhumed the Rebbe Rashab and they buried him in Rostov nearby in the new cemetery where he's buried until today. When they came back to the United States, the Rebbe asked them to come into his room. And the Rebbe gave them instructions. They had to fast for 3 days before and only eat at night. They had to go to mikveh twice a day. They had to learn certain of the Rebbe Rashab's Hasidic discourses. In other words, they had to prepare themselves. They came into the room and the Rebbe asked them pointed questions. Where was he buried? And the Rebbe asked them, was his body intact? So they said to him, the Rebbe wanted them to re-dunk him in the mikveh. So they had to take off the shrouds and they said to the Rebbe that his body was fully intact. He had a crack in his nail, to which the Rebbe cried bitter tears. Anyway, they buried him. So we see from that story that the Rebbe Rashab's body did not decompose. When they buried the Rebbe, which is 8 years, or I don't know how many years. Hold on a second. The Rebbe passed away in 90. The Rebbe passed away in 94, and he became Rebbe in 51, right? The previous Rebbe died in 1950, so 44 years. When they buried the Rebbe next to the previous Rebbe, and it was hand dug. It was if you were from Kollel, if you were a newly married man, you were asked to take a shovel and dig the grave. So when they dug the grave, they uncovered the previous Rebbe's grave, and the previous Rebbe's casket was intact, which I don't know if you know how rare this is. I was present when they exhumed the body here in New Montefiore, and the person was buried 3 months, and the casket was no longer intact. So the casket was intact. So that was that for 44 years for the casket not to just completely deteriorate. Anyway, so Yosef said we have to embalm him. They went to Pharaoh, and Yosef said, I swore to my father, and Pharaoh said, yes, kasha hishbiacho, do as you swore. There's a midrash that says that Pharaoh made Yosef swear. When Yosef came to meet Pharaoh for the very first time, Yosef said to Pharaoh in Hebrew, Shalom Aleichem, to which Pharaoh didn't know what he was talking about because only a few people knew that language. And Pharaoh said to Yosef, please do not tell anybody that I don't know this language. I know many languages. I pride myself, but I don't know this language. So Yosef said, I will. He goes, swear to me that you don't tell anybody. He goes, I will. So then when Yosef came to him, he says, I swore. It was almost like a hint that if you make me undo one swearing, I'll undo the other swearing. So he let him go. And he says, I give you permission. And basically everybody,
the whole army with him.
The Pharaoh sent the Senate with him. Pharaoh sent very, very high-ranking people, and they traveled and they traveled, and they all the elders and only they left only the kids and their sheep. So it was kind of they left in the land of Goshen, and they crossed into the river, over the river Jordan, and they went into the land of Israel, and they mourned him. And they say that all the kings of that area, the chiefs of the tribes, it says that they when they saw a crown that was made for Jacob placed on the coffin, they took off their crowns and they placed it on the coffin as well, on the casket, to show their recognition that a king has died. And they sat Shiva for 7 days after burial. This is one of the places we know about Shiva, and they actually called the place where they sat Shiva, Ovel Mitzrayim, the great mourning of Egypt. So they buried him in Hebron, and they returned to Egypt. When they returned to Egypt, the brother said, uh-oh, now father's dead, we're in deep trouble. And they said, Lou, perhaps Yosef's going to take, he's going to use to many Yosef. Yosef's hatred for us is going to come out. Lou means perhaps, or Lou means we wish. So perhaps, they were nervous perhaps. It also means, according to another commentary, I saw this commentary by Jacob J. Hecht, that said that we hope Yosef takes his anger out on us and leaves our kids alone. That let him do whatever he wants to us, but let him, as long as he feeds our kids. They went to Yosef and said, your father commanded before his death to say, take care of your family. Now it's interesting, right? It's interesting. Nowhere do we find that Yosef had commanded anybody, that Yaakov had commanded anybody for Yosef to take care of his kids. So one of the commentaries says it was a lie. It was a lie. But it could have done, it could have been, but in the Torah we don't find. Right, they were afraid, and Yosef cried, and Yosef said, "It's not me."
Specifically, he noted that to be number 2 in the NFL in the red zone and then number 1 on third down.
I'm not making noise if you mute yourself. Thank you. So Yosef said, "It's not me. It's not me. God sent me here. Everything is divine providence. God has a master plan. I was sent down here. Am I instead of God?" He says, "I'm going to do mine. God does his, and you do yours. And don't worry, I'm going to take care of you." Yosef lived, Torah tells us, 110 years, and before he passed, he called his kids, and he said, "I don't want to be buried here. I want to be Pakad Yifkad Eschem, when God remembers you and takes you out of Egypt. Pakad Yifkad, when God remembers you, he said it twice, then I want you to take my bones from here." He knew Pharaoh would never give permission to him to go up. But when you leave Egypt, take my bones. And that's what they did. And it's interesting. When God met Moses for the first time by the burning bush, he used exactly the same term. Pakad Pakadati. I have remembered a double. So that was almost like a hint. They knew that Yosef said that strange expression. And when God met Moses at the burning bush, he used that same double entendre that I remembered you. Yosef said, anyway, so Yosef died. They put him in a coffin and put him in the Nile. The Nile was considered the most prestigious place to be buried before they used pyramids, because the Nile was the source of their life, their food. So they placed Joseph, a holy man, in the Nile. They placed him in a lead coffin. And when they left Egypt, they actually, Moses wrote on a piece of parchment. He wrote God's name, and he wrote, "Ale Shur, come up, ox," and he threw it in the Nile. And Joseph's coffin, to Joseph's coffin, rose to the surface, and they were able to take the coffin. However, somebody of poor character grabbed that piece of parchment. His name was Micha. And Micha, when Aaron threw all the gold into the fire, when the people complained that Moses was dead, he threw that parchment into the fire, which said God's name, Ale Shur, come up, ox. And a little golden calf walked out of the fire. So that's the rest of the story. So Yosef said, "I want you to bury me in Egypt," which they did. And he says they embalmed him as well. And they placed him in the Nile. Now it says, the very last verse, it says they buried Yosef, even though it just said it 2 verses earlier that Yosef lived 110 years. It says Yosef died at 110. So they explain, why does it say it twice? Is because Yosef never gave up his name Yosef. So Pharaoh had given him a completely other name, gave him an Egyptian name by the name of Tzafnat Paneach. But Yosef refused to be called by that name until the day he died. He was Yosef. So he was Yosef, and he remained Yosef. He never gave up that name from which he was given, even by divine, even by the edict of Pharaoh that his name be changed. He never did. To the last day.
Joseph lived only to 110. That was.
So they say Yosef was supposed to live to 120. It's a good question. Say Yosef lost 10 years of his life. He was punished. And the reason why is because in the dialogue with his brothers before he revealed himself, the brothers said to him, "We are your servants." And he says, is your father alive? He says, "Your servant, our father, is still alive." And he never objected to say, "Don't call him servant." But he didn't. So they said it 5 times. And the interpreter, who was his son, said it 5 times. And Yosef never objected. So for each time Yosef heard it and never objected, he lost a year of his life. So instead of 120, he died at 110. We don't know what age the brothers died, but it seems to be that Yosef died one of the youngest. Because when Yosef died, some brothers were still alive, and he waited until Pharaoh waited until all the brothers died to begin the exile and the hardships. Thus concludes our Torah portion. May you be well, and may the Schwartz be with you. God bless.